Hello and welcome to week 2. In this week we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about chapter 3, and this lecture is over the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. So we're going to start this discussion of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction, and in particular Article 3 of the United States Constitution. And you can find much of the material we'll cover in Chapter 3 of our text on pages 57 through 68. Now, jurisdiction refers to the power of a court to hear and decide a case. This means that there are some cases a court can hear, but it can't decide. Ex parte Macardal, which is in this chapter, is an example of one. And there are various types of jurisdiction, but the basic definition is the power to hear and decide a case. Now, the Supreme Court has a special type of jurisdiction called judicial supremacy. And this means that the Supreme Court can hear and decide a case authoritatively for some other parts of government in the federal system. There are two types of judicial supremacy. The first one is called national judicial supremacy. This means that the Supreme Court can hear and decide a case authoritatively for the federal system, and that means mostly the states, but also in instances where the states and the national government conflict with each other. So when a case comes to the Supreme Court from a state Supreme Court, it is using its power of national judicial supremacy to hear and decide that case. Interestingly enough, this type of jurisdiction can be inferred from the text of the Constitution, and there is evidence that the framers of Article 3 intended the Supreme Court to say, intended the Supreme Court to say what the Constitution means for the states when disputes arise, or when they arise between states and the national government. But not everyone believed this. And so there was a lot of conflict over it for years and years, extending through the Civil War, actually. So the second type is simply called judicial supremacy, and this one doesn't appear in the Constitution at all. It is the power of the Supreme Court to hear and decide a case authoritatively for the other two co-equal branches of the national government, the Congress and the President. You might already know that the Supreme Court reached out and grasped this power for itself in a case called Marbury versus Madison. And doing so is very problematic, actually, which we'll discuss. So the Supreme Court's power, its jurisdiction, comes from two sources. It comes from Article 3 of the Constitution, and it specifies the types of Article 3 specifies the types of cases over which the Supreme Court will have original jurisdiction, which is basically the Supreme Court functioning as a trial court. And then also Article 3 specifies the court's appellate jurisdiction, which means that it will review the decisions of lower courts, lower federal and state courts, in other words, hear appeals. So the Supreme Court is actually a court that functions both as a trial court and an appellate court. Now, given, honestly, the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction is very small, and very few cases come to it under its original jurisdiction. It's primarily an appellate court, a court of appellate jurisdiction. But the Constitution does have both. Now, the other source of the court's jurisdiction is an act of Congress called the Judiciary Act of 1789. Using its power in Article 3 to organize the court system and supervise the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction, Congress passed this act in 1789. Article 3 is the shortest of the three articles. Okay? It is the shortest of the first three articles creating the national government. It has the shortest discussion of the Supreme Court as an institution, and this is true primarily for two reasons. First, none of the framers had ever been judges. They had been members of state legislatures and the Continental Congress. Some had been governors, but none of them had been judges, and none knew anything really about structuring court systems. Secondly, no one really knew what the federal courts were supposed to do. Most conflicts at the time occurred among citizens within states, and state courts handled these just fine. So why have a national court system? There wasn't a clear answer to that up front. Now, when writing Article 3, as the screen says, many people were concerned about limiting federal power, and so there was a debate about states' rights versus federal power, and a lot of people argued that there shouldn't even really be a federal court system, that the state courts would handle any conflicts just fine. So Article 3, as a compromise, just provided the briefest sketch of what the Supreme Court and federal courts would look like. Article 3 is a compromise between these two sides. Okay. Now, the Judiciary Act did everything from creating circuit courts. Initially, there were 3. Now there are 11 circuits in the United States, plus the District of Columbia and the Federal Circuit, which is for special courts. But the Judiciary Act actually was the first major law passed by Congress, and it created these circuit courts, and it created federal trial courts, and originally there were 13 federal trial courts. Now there are at least 1 trial court for each state, plus D.C. and Puerto Rico, and many states have many, many more federal district courts, trial courts. It did everything from creating these courts to restating the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction and its original jurisdiction, and creating the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction. Now, these courts heard very different cases than federal trial courts and appellate courts here today. And this is probably because our economy was very different. Most of our economy occurred within states. State courts supervised it. And Congress also created very different kinds of jurisdiction for these courts. In other cases, state courts handled most disputes, and federal courts had a much more limited role. So it was this act that in which Congress first stated that the Supreme Court could review decisions of state Supreme Courts that had something to do with interpreting the federal Constitution, a congressional act, or a treaty. In fact, that's at the heart of a case called Martin versus Hunter's Lessee. In that case, the Supreme Court of Virginia refused to abide by the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. And the Supreme Court ruled against the state of Virginia, and then the state of Virginia absolutely refused to abide by the Supreme Court's decision. And so in Martin, the Supreme Court just gives the state of Virginia a lecture and spends most of its time, in its opinion, explaining why Virginia had to abide by its decision. Finally, Article 13 of the Judiciary Act reiterates the court's original jurisdiction, but then it does something odd. It adds something to the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. It gave the Supreme Court, under its original jurisdiction, the power to issue what are called writs of mandamus. Now, that's not in Article 3 of the Constitution. If you read that article, you won't find the word mandamus in it. A writ of mandamus is a document issued by a court to an official ordering that person to do his or her job. So let's say you elect a tax collector in your county, but that person refuses to collect taxes. And now down in the state capitol, people are getting worried. They need money to run things. Where are those taxes? The tax collector maybe is opposed to taxation and refuses to do his or her job. Well, the state legislature could instruct the attorney general to go to a court, a state court, and get it to issue a writ of mandamus. And that writ would be directed at that tax collector, and it would say, do your job or we will hold you in contempt of court. But the problem is that Congress added that to the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction. And the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is set in stone in Article 3. this Section 13 really creates some problems later, and the Supreme Court uses a challenge, a person coming to the Supreme Court requesting a writ of mandamus, to grasp a broad power to declare any act of Congress, not simply acts dealing with court processes and jurisdiction, but any act, unconstitutional. And that's kind of our crash course in Supreme Court jurisdiction. Thank you very much for listening.